And welcome back to the Constitution Line by Line. I'm Paul Fabrizio, political scientist.
Sort of walked all over you. I was so enthusiastic. Yes, you are Paul Fabrizio, political science here at McMurray University. I'm Don Frazier in the history department.
That's right.
And we are wading through the Constitution line by line because it's important. It's important for our fellow citizens to actually take the time to review the document that governs the nation.
We're not doing this just because we have free time.
Yeah, that's right. We're doing this as a labor of love. It's
for our Constitution.
Yes, and for our country.
And there you
this
go.
This is our love poem to the nation.
And one other thing, there's a lot of people who say the United States is in the midst of a constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
Right now because of the conflicts between the presidency and the Congress. And if we're in a constitutional crisis, and I'm not sure that we are, I think we should understand the Constitution.
Yeah, a lot of people saying we're in a constitutional crisis probably haven't read the Constitution. So, you know what? We're going to solve that.
Yeah.
It's just going to take a little effort on our part and your part to get through this.
So, if you want to send this along to our representatives in Congress and to our president,
send them a link. Their staffers ought to look at this
exactly.
because this might be useful for their job.
And maybe we'll get an invitation to Washington, D.C.
I doubt it.
Yeah,
I think we will labor along in anonymity, but
that's okay.
Yeah, that's the way it goes.
That's the way it goes. All right, so we are on Article 3, which is the judicial branch, Section 2, which is the jurisdiction of the federal courts, Clause 1, Part C.
Just rolling along on this long clause.
We are. So this one is very simple. The judicial power shall extend to all cases of admiralty and maritime jurisdiction.
Well, somebody's got to solve issues that involve boats on the high seas that may be American flagged or otherwise.
Yes. And waterways.
Well, sure.
And you can see where this would lead to. When does it stop? Does it include stock tanks?
Yeah, what if it's just damp sand?
Yeah. And in fact, we bring this up because there have been issues that have gone before the Supreme Court involving the power of the federal government to legislate areas where there once was water, where there is water today. And how much water does it take for the federal government to be involved? Our first thought in looking at admiralty and maritime jurisdiction is we're talking about, as you said, the high seas.
High seas, yeah.
But then you think about it, well, the St. Lawrence Seaway, is that a high sea? Mm-hmm. Is the Mississippi River a high sea?
The Niagara River.
Is the Niagara River. And then you go, well, if that counts, what about the Chattahoochee River between Georgia and Alabama? Or the Red River?
Tin-Tom Waterway. What about a canal?
Yeah, exactly. And how far does this jurisdiction extend? And we know that the Environmental Protection Agency, in their effort to conserve water as well as to protect the environment, has really reached, some would say, too far into waterways that have no connection with other waterways, that have no connection to things going on in other states.
I have a real-life example of that sort of interference. In West Texas, there's such a thing as a playa lake, and these lakes are only full of water in the wettest of the wet season.
Okay.
And then that water disappears pretty fast, and it goes back to being just pasture.
Right.
All right. So the Environmental Protection Agency came in and declared these wetlands.
Okay.
Because of their vital role with the American flyway with birds and waterfowl, things like that. And so farmers are going, wait a second, I have to make a conservation zone out of these 2 acres just because the soil type is clay underneath it and it can retain water. And why, yes, you must.
Do.
Yeah, and it would be theoretically upheld in federal court because of this particular semi-clause.
How far does that power extend?
Yeah.
And, this is the classic conflict. Is it a state issue? Is it a federal issue? Is it a private property issue?
Yeah, no kidding.
And what we've seen over time is that the federal government has gone beyond, I think, where the framers had originally intended. as they extend their regulatory powers.
Because in the context of the time, they're really concerned about shipping.
Yes, yes.
And there is no real shipping on the Mississippi yet. I mean, it's the western boundary of the United States when this is being drawn up, when this is being conceived. And you had more issues of the Spanish on the Mississippi than you did with shipping jurisdictions. But
so you're happy to have the federal government
involved.
It'd
be nice to have the federal government involved in the Mississippi in that case.
Their military.
Yeah. And, the Spanish even put a fleet on the Mississippi to keep the Americans out. It was an early border patrol, but that's a whole different issue.
Story.
Yeah. But what's interesting is during the sectional crisis of the mid-19th century, specifically over slavery, the transportation of slaves on the high seas was going to end up becoming an issue because Congress has jurisdiction to legislate on that, and then the Supreme Court has the power to rule on questions over that. And so what Southerners were afraid of, and probably correctly, was that Congress would say, great, you can no longer transport slaves from one state to another state on the high seas.
Oh.
So now the problem with that is your highest concentration of available slaves would have been on the East Coast and then arcing down through the Deep South. But if you're trying to get those slaves, say, from Virginia to New Orleans,
you got to go high seas.
Well, the most cost-efficient way to do it is to go by high seas. Otherwise, you're chaining them together in a long caravan of human misery and transporting them overland. And that adds to your cost, adds to your overhead for labor. You got to watch them, you got to guard them, you have to bed them down, things like that. It's a big nightmare. And so it's interesting that the judicial jurisdiction would also back up that congressional jurisdiction over issues dealing with boats.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. Commerce again, just in a really
horrible way,
in kind of a dark stain on it. But
wow. Okay.
But a lot of people don't realize the implications. Include things like that.
Yeah. You wonder if the framers did. I mean, because clearly they knew about slavery, they knew about the slave trade, they knew about the
They thought they dealt with it. They thought they dealt with slavery. By not doing anything and having it expired by 1808.
Yeah.
They figured they dealt with slavery because then slavery would kind of die a natural death over the course of the next 3 generations.
Except the Southerners weren't hoping it would die a natural death.
Well, they just they also understood that slavery, the internal migration of slaves, would require national expansion.
Right.
And the expansion of slavery was the only way to keep it viable. So that's a whole different kettle of fish. Speaking of fish, now the Supreme Court or other federal courts have jurisdiction over the high seas.
There you go.
There you go. So
all right.
That's our line.
There's our line. We'll be back.